Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you for listening, and even though we're a few weeks into it, Happy New Year again to you all. This week we speak with President Jefferson again. I'm so pleased. We've talked to him 3 weeks in a row, and it's just been delightful.
To get ready for this program, I've been rereading Dumas Malone. I read the first 100 pages of his book on Jefferson's first term. It's a 6-volume biography. It's regarded as definitive, if a little too favorable to Jefferson, too apologetic towards Jefferson, but it's wonderful. It's one of the greatest biographies of the 20th century, and I haven't read it for a long time.
You know, we got an inquiry from somebody, David Donovan, who was trying to buy Merrill Peterson's book. And he said the Apple ebook costs $75. But I bet you would say it's worth every penny.
Well, no, yes and no. It's a great biography, but I think if you go to abebooks.com or eBay, you can probably find one for a fraction of that cost. What's the man's name?
David Donovan. Actually, he was looking for an ebook. I actually did the same thing, and he's right. It's very expensive. I'm not sure why they do that.
Well, I have several copies. If he'll send me a check for $22,000, I'll sign it and send it off to him.
Noted.
There are public libraries, of course.
I hate to bring this up because it's kind of sad, but I've learned that the Cuba trip is not going to happen this year.
One of the last things that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo did was to put Cuba on the terror watch list. You know, there's a certain sense in which this crowd tried to do as much damage in the last minute as it could possibly do, or at least to accomplish things that would be so politically unpalatable during normal days that they could just do it as a kind of a defiant gesture going out. So we've had our boot on the neck of Cuba for far too long, since 1960, and it might have made sense once. It makes absolutely no sense now. I do think that our policy with respect to Cuba is really irrational and unsound. And I do get I met them in South Florida. I met the expats who came over after the revolution. They've been waiting all this time for the Castro regime to collapse and a return to a capitalist market society. That's not going to happen during their lifetime. I understand their bitterness, but there are fewer and fewer of them. It's like the World War II generation. They're fading from the scene. Their children and grandchildren are much less concerned about all of these questions than the people who were alive in 1959 or 1960 were. It's time for us to engage in what Ronald Reagan called constructive engagement with Cuba. In other words, to be hard on them, to demand greater attention to due process and human rights. Not that it's out of control, but it's not great. But then to liberalize our relationship with Cuba so that we can influence the future of this really remarkable island. And that's a lot to say, except the bottom line in this is that we're just postponing for 1 year. But the Salmon River trip, the River of No Return trip, is almost full. If you want to come through a 14,000-mile wilderness, it's as pristine as you could possibly imagine. It's the second deepest canyon in America, deeper, if you can imagine it, than the Grand Canyon. And I came away just so excited. So if people want to come on that, now is the time to sign up for that. But even more interesting, David, are these online courses. So the Constitution course for February is full. Then we're going to do Hamlet. And then we're going to repeat the J. Robert Oppenheimer Cultural Tour. And so there are lots of people who want that, and we can now deliver it by Zoom. So lots and lots and lots is going on. I'm still writing for Governing Magazine. People should go there. And my books are all available on Amazon, and especially the two most recent ones, the book about pandemics in literature and history. And then there's the other book, more recent, which is actually more important now than when it was published, which is Donald Trump and the Death of American Integrity, an Autopsy and Path Forward. So I think 2021 is going to be one of my great years. I'm as happy almost as I've ever been in my life. And who would have known that could come from the disruptions, not the least of which is the global pandemic. So what about you? What's your 2021 going to be, my friend?
Well, my immediate 2021 is I think it's time to move on to the show. This week's episode, A Few Plain Duties.
It is time. Happy New Year, everyone, and thanks for listening. And sign up for online courses and the salmon trip, the river of no return. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and I am so pleased to speak with you, President Jefferson. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. I always look forward to our conversations, and I've anticipated this one. Before we begin, because it is going to be of a political nature, I would just like to take a moment and note that I am in the frozen north and you are in a much warmer area, shall we say. My thoughts, however, even in this frozen ground that I live upon, are turning toward gardening, sir. I've begun to plan my garden for this year, and thanks to you, I have years of garden books that you encouraged me to start, so I can look back and think about what I want to do differently this year to improve things, and it's a good thought, as I say, on my frozen ground.
Keeping records of this sort is extremely important so that you might determine that in such and such a year you can plant lettuce on the 1st of February. But if your lettuce is frozen out 3 years in a row, and you have records to show that, then you might revise and say, I guess I won't plant my lettuce until the 20th of February or the 1st of March. In other words, these records are not just a kind of bookkeeping or a journal so that you can look back fondly in later years to your garden records. These are aids in discovering patterns of weather, what plants flourish and what plants don't, the seasons at which plants should be begun and harvested, the yields. So perhaps if you start let's say your tobacco crop on such and such a date and you get X tons of tobacco at the end of the year, but a different year you plant it on another date and you get 2X, then you have to ask yourself, was that soil conditions? Was that weather conditions? Was it better hoeing? Was it a better strain of tobacco? Did it depend at all on the calendar of planting and harvest and so on? Those records are vital for gardening. And of course, in your time, you don't need a garden. You might want one, but your food supply is not dependent upon the success of your gardens. In my time, it was. In my time, everybody had to provide more or less their own produce. And if you did it badly, it's not that you would starve, but that you might be hungry. You might have periods of exigency. And so these records are fun, to be sure. I like keeping records. Something really pleases me psychologically about keeping really accurate records. But the purpose of it is to learn from nature and to make sure that we have enough food to eat and enough to distribute amongst those who depend upon us.
I was hoping this week that we could talk about the first days of your first term as president. Before we do, indulge me in one more personal note, if I might, sir.
Of course.
You mentioned earlier growing lettuce, which is something that I do. I, of course, can't plant my lettuce on the 1st of February, but you had advice to grow, I believe you said, a thimbleful of lettuce seed every week.
Yes, beginning right now. So this is the end of January, the beginning of February here at Monticello, and it's not time yet to produce corn or even potatoes, but it is early enough to try lettuce. And of course, lettuce seed is essentially free, and so each week take essentially a thimbleful of lettuce and plant one row, and then the next week another row, and the week after that a third. This has two advantages. One is you're certainly going to get lettuce, and also you can extend your lettuce season not through the summer. There's a period at which lettuce is not really going to grow in the hot sun at Monticello, but you can extend the lettuce season dramatically, considerably, by planting a new row each week.
Well, sir, this year I'm going to do that. And then on to the subject I mentioned earlier, and that is, sir, your first term as president, the first days of your presidency. Nowadays, it's sort of common to refer to a new president in terms of his first 100 days. Sometimes presidents get what is called a honeymoon period. Was there anything like that, any measurement like that during your time, sir?
Well, there was a good deal of uncertainty. The Federalists were frightened of my administration and assumed that I was going to be a French-style radical and maybe tear up Mr. Hamilton's fiscal system, or maybe split up the country, or to be so concerned about the national debt as to starve out the armed services and so on. So there was a lot of uncertainty about what sort of a president I would be. Fortunately, however, I had a majority in both houses of Congress. These were Jeffersonian Republicans, and they were disposed to cooperate because they shared my general vision of this country. So I wanted to get a great deal done, but not much of it was legislative at the beginning. So let me back up and try to describe it. The White House was unfinished. It was really unfinished. It came up wooden stairs, temporary wooden stairs, and across a wooden plank in the floor, and that was never really completed until my second term. The plaster was still settling on some of the walls. Many of the rooms were essentially empty because they had so little furniture. And so there was a sense of being in a large unfinished space that wasn't particularly well heated. I loved it, of course. I saw it as a rural seat. I could see the Potomac River. I could see fields and trees and grasses around me. It had a beautiful bucolic aspect for me. Nor was the Capitol complete. So the Senate chamber was more or less complete, but the House not. And there was a temporary House chamber that was called the Oven, made of brick. It was an ugly building, but it certainly worked. And so the Capitol was a construction site, essentially, and the road between, Pennsylvania Avenue, was just mud, very uneven, pigs rooting in the streets. So it was, in some sense, a trail. And Washington City had almost no amenities, a few sort of rugged boarding houses, but no shops and cafes, no bookstore, no wine store, really a frontier village in many respects. And so that sort of gives you a sense of the Washington that I came to. I was the second president to live in the White House, the first to be inaugurated in Washington City. So that was there. But the number one thing I wanted to do as the new president of the United States was to undo some things that had been attempted by the Federalist Congress during the Adams administration. And I speak particularly of the Alien, Sedition, and Naturalization laws, which were passed in the war scare of 1898, and which I consider to be worthy of the Middle Ages, the 9th or 10th century, and palpable violations of the Bill of Rights. So not only did I watch gladly when those pieces of legislation expired, some of them were built to expire in 1801, but I also used the pardon power. The president, as you know, has the power of an almost absolute pardon. And I pardoned several of the people who had been jailed under the sedition law, and I remitted their fines because I believed that this is the proper use of the pardon power to release from prison people who were either wrongly convicted, or people who were persecuted by the law, or people who needed mercy because their health had broken, or that they had shown real signs of rehabilitation. So I did that. And then in terms of my policy, the most important thing that I wanted to do as president was to reduce the size of the national debt as quickly and as severely as possible. I was fortunate in that Albert Gallatin was my Secretary of the Treasury. He was every bit as talented as Alexander Hamilton, and not even a fraction as ambitious or selfish or self-aggrandizing. And so the thing we really set out to do was to not only balance the budget, that was easy, but to begin to pay off Mr. Hamilton's national debt. And Gallatin proved to be an absolute adept at this. So these were things that the administrative government can do that don't require acts of Congress, is my point. And I also then finally changed the style of the presidency. My two predecessors had adopted a semi-monarchical manner of ceremonial swords and parades and carriages and liveried servants and formal levies and so on. And I regarded all that as wrong-headed, but also a bit ridiculous. And so I instituted a plain Republican protocol style as president and toned down the executive office considerably because I felt that we were in danger of moving towards an actual monarchy if we continued down the path of George Washington and Mr. Adams.
Mr. Jefferson, something that you said in that previous statement really rang in my ears. You balanced the budget, and that was easy. It certainly wouldn't be in my time, sir.
Well, you've changed your expectations of government. I called government a few plain duties performed by a few honest men. What does government really need to do? Not what it might wish to do or what might be interesting for it to do or beneficial for it to do or popular for it to do, but what does government need to do? That's my criterion. So, does government need to have a national endowment for the arts? No, of course not. Does government need to pave roads? No, that can be done by private enterprise or by states. So what does government actually need to do? It's in our interest not to aggrandize that, sir, because remember, to do anything, government is taking money out of your pocket. Government can't do anything without removing money from your pocket and redirecting it to some end that government says is an important one. So what do we need? We need a post office, of course. We need a judicial system. You need that. You also need a defense department, a war department, and a navy department so that you can defend our coasts and harbors from the possibility of attack by a foreign entity. And I'm now beginning to run out of legitimate things for government to do. The rest is something you have added over your 200-plus year history. None of this would stand up in my time, either because it would be unconstitutional, which I believe, or because you haven't balanced your budget. But then you invent new ways to spend the people's money. And so you're eroding public confidence in government from both ends of the fiscal spectrum.
We need to take a short break. When we return, I'd like to talk to you a bit more about the two parties, the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists, if that would be all right, sir.
Of course, it's a disagreeable subject, but I'm prepared to speak about it.
We're going to take just a short break, but we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. We've been talking about your first days in office during your first term in the presidency, sir. And one of the things I noted was, as you mentioned, the two parties, yours, the Jeffersonian Republicans, and the Federalists. And the Federalists really fell out of power after your election. But I noted that you kept many of their appointees in place.
Yes. First of all, I believe in unity. The minute you become the president of the United States, in some regards, you cease to be a party leader and you become the president of all of the people, both those who voted for you and those who did not, those who approve of your vision of America and those who don't. And in order to conciliate the Federalists, I wanted to be as centrist as I possibly could be. I believe that a good president administers the government and is very cautious about his initiatives. The Federalists believed that I was a dangerous man, a Jacobin, a kind of a radical, and that I was likely to destroy much of the American system, that I might repudiate the Constitution, but they certainly felt that I would damage or destroy Mr. Hamilton's fiscal system, or completely remove every Federalist officeholder and sweep the slate clean and install my own people. I did none of those things because I wanted to win over as many of the Federalists as I possibly could. And so I didn't do the things that I might have wanted to do in an imaginary utopia. I did the things that were likely to receive considerable support from both political parties. And I wanted the Federalists to come around. And for that reason, I was as moderate as I possibly could be. And I didn't take on dangerous innovations. And it worked. By 1804, the Federalists had sputtered out because they saw that the country was prospering under my administration. And by the way, I had very little to do with that. They saw that the country was at peace under my administration. They realized that I had not dismantled Mr. Hamilton's system. I had merely chastened it some, that I hadn't done wholesale removal of office holders. I only removed those who were angry, diehard Federalists, which I had every right to do, of course, and I used attrition to begin to fill offices with people of my own political stamp. So if someone died or retired, that person would inevitably be a Republican. But if the Federalist was doing his job well and was not an enemy to my work, I kept him on as long as he wished to stay. And so these were my policies, and they had the effect of conciliating much of the Federalist opposition. And in fact, some Federalists wound up saying, well, he's really more Federalist in many respects than he's a Republican, which I don't think is quite fair. But I wasn't sorry to have them believe that. And the country calmed down. And by 1804, I was resoundingly reelected in what you would call a landslide. Only 2 states cast their electoral votes for somebody else in 1804. And now I had what you would call a mandate. People approved of my system, and Mr. Madison continued it, and James Monroe continued that. So this eventually led in Mr. Monroe's administration to a new national motto or a new phrase. They called it the era of good government, the era of good feelings. There was a sense in which the country was calm.
You recognize that there was great division when you first came into office. And yet I know you, sir, that you were most certainly, looking for a harmonious government. Our current president said that consensus is quite important. In fact, he said democracy can't work without it.
Well, I believe that's so. I believe that if I had followed a radical path, that it would have further divided the country, and the people that were frightened of me would never have come around. It was very important for me to emphasize what we shared. I meant it in my first inaugural address when I said we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And I think that, majority rules. I had majorities in both houses. I could essentially accomplish legislatively anything that I chose. But I didn't want to do that by riding roughshod over the Federalists. I didn't want them to become permanently alienated or disaffected or determined to be obstructionist just for the purpose of being obstructionist. I wanted them to think, well, that policy of Mr. Jefferson's is not really such a bad thing after all. He's surprisingly moderate. He sought consensus. He invited Federalists to supper at the White House and listened carefully to their concerns, and he's, to the extent possible, has accommodated our concerns. That was my goal, and I don't say that every president should follow that. Obviously, times change, and the political dynamics are different at different eras in American history, but I was a harmony lover, and I also believe that what we share, if you take the Federalists and sort of distill what their view is, they want a little more government. They want a little more centralized government. They want to favor merchants and the economy and industry over agriculture. But they aren't our enemies. These are honest differences of political policy. And although I think they were wrong in much of this and that they were anti-democratic in some of it, I didn't regard them as enemies to the future of America. I believe that elections matter. And I was glad that I was elected in 1800. I believe that even though it was a very hotly contested election, I believe the great majority of Americans agreed more or less with my point of view, and that the Federalists had been, in a certain sense, a minority that captured the electoral machine of the country and used it effectively for 12 years, but they did not truly represent the 6 million people of the country. I believe that my own approach more fully represented the will of most of the 6 million Americans. And so I was closer to being a small d Democratic president or a more representative president than my predecessors had been. And that was partly from a difference of political philosophy. My view is that the people are sovereign and that our leaders must listen very, very carefully to what the people want. and try to fulfill that. And the Federalists believed, and I'm not trying to caricature them at all, but they believed that they were smarter and wiser than the people, and that they needed to lead the people, and the people needed to be led, and that the people should really defer to men like Hamilton, because they were their betters. They were better informed, and they were better educated, and they had a more global view of things. I see the point, but I don't believe it. I believe that average people deserve representation every bit as much as the elites. And frankly, I believe that average people can govern themselves as well as the elites can do, and maybe better, because they're not filled with their own sense of their mastery and domination.
Mr. Jefferson, you said two things in your previous statement that always ring in my ears when I hear them from you, and those are elections matter and majority rules. We're in a situation now in America where we're quite divided, and I'll use the Senate as the example. The Senate is split 50-50, and so it is the president of the Senate, the vice president, who would cast the deciding vote. You were in that position, weren't you, sir?
Yes, I served as the vice president under John Adams from 1796 until 1800. Even though we had significant differences of opinion and different ideas about public policy, I was the person who got the second largest number of electoral votes, and before the 12th Amendment, that meant that I was the vice president. So I presided over the Senate. I never had to cast the decisive vote. There was never a time when there was a tie in the Senate that required me to break the tie as vice president.
But in my time, sir, it's very possible that will happen. So when we get to that statement of majority rules, it's a pretty slim majority. Now, you, sir, wrote rules for the Senate that are still in place.
True, I was so bored by presiding over the Senate. You know, the founding fathers in Philadelphia didn't know what to do with the vice president. He really exists for one purpose only, and that is in the case that the president dies in office, that there is a person who is ready to take command immediately. And so that's the only purpose of a vice president. The founding fathers felt that they had to do something more for this poor bloke, and so they allowed him to be the presiding officer of the Senate without a vote, except in the case of a tie, and without any considerable speaking opportunities either. He's not meant to deliver speeches and hold forth. He's meant to sit quietly and behave as a parliamentarian, except when there is an even tie in the voting of the Senate, and that was really just a gift to provide the vice president something or other to do. And so I was in that role. A lot of, if anyone's ever watched legislation in action, it's a tedious business. There's a lot of foolish parliamentary procedure. There are empty speeches, there are repetitive speeches, there are endless speeches. There's a lot of huff and puff with very little legislative efficiency in a legislative body of any sort. And so I didn't know what to do. So I decided that I would while away the time by creating a manual of Senate procedure. You know, this is before Robert's Rules of Order. This is a period when parliamentary procedure was still largely amorphous and unclarified. So I decided to write a manual of Senate procedure, and did. I wrote to my old mentor, George Wythe, and said, help me, you know, and he sent such suggestions as he could, and then I formulated this, and the Senate approved it, and it was used and is still used in your time, although very considerable changes have been made in it. The filibuster, for example, was not part of my manual of Senate procedure. So that was what I did. I'm glad to say that it helped to clarify our legislative process somewhat.
A great deal of the Senate's power to establish rules comes from Article 1, Section 5 of the United States Constitution. It states each House may determine the rules of its proceedings. But as you mentioned, the filibuster, and now we have reconciliation, it's possible for the Senate in a 50-50 split for one party to force policies and laws on the other. It gets a bit I'm not sure what the right word is. It's a bit dicey, perhaps.
It's important to go back to first principles. So we're a republic. We're not an oligarchy or a kleptocracy or a monarchy or an aristocracy. We're a republic. And thanks to Montesquieu, we decided to have two houses of Congress, not just one. The only person that was really in favor of a unicameral system was Benjamin Franklin, and he was not taken very seriously in that. And so we have a House of Representatives elected every second year, which is meant to be closer to the people, to listen more carefully to the interests of the people. And then we have a Senate, which is at one remove, well, two removes. One is that it's elected every sixth year. And secondly, in my time, the senators were not elected by the people of their states. They were elected by the legislative bodies of their states. That's since been changed by an amendment to your Constitution. So the Senate was meant to be a little more refined, a little more detached, that they would slow things down, they would ponder, they would take things under greater advisement, that they didn't need to be quite so responsive to the immediate will of the people. They could, with the long terms, they could afford to thwart whims or waves of fanaticism or things that are temporarily popular. I think it's George Washington who famously said that the Senate is like a dish of tea. You pour the tea into the saucer to cool it before you sip it. And so the House is the hotter of the two beverages, and the Senate is meant to cool that soup or tea before it's sipped. So that was the principle, that we would divide the will of the people in these ways. And the president, of course, could veto and so on. Well, the Senate is not meant to be so detached from the will of the people as to be unrepresentative. So it seems to me that majority rule needs to obtain in both houses, that the Senate's detachment is structurally there already under the provisions of the Constitution. We don't need to give it greater detachment from the will of the people by requiring supermajorities. The only supermajorities that are required in the Constitution of the United States are for treaties and for impeachments. In other words, a simple majority prevails in almost every legislative event. But if you're impeaching a Supreme Court justice or the president, you need a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and you need a 2/3 majority for some other things that governments do. But for the most part, majority rule is the idea. And the closer that the House of Representatives, in my time or yours, or the Senate of the United States, in my time or yours, adheres to the principle of simple majority rule, the more small d democratic a country we will be. And that's the way it ought to be, because the people, I remind you, are sovereign. The people are the country, and they have chosen representatives to do public work for them. But they have not said that the Congress of the United States should ignore the will of the people. What they have said is the Congress should distill the will of the people and try as thoughtfully as possible to install that by way of public policy.
And finally, sir, I know you wouldn't do this publicly as the gentleman you are, but if you had a private conversation with our current president and he asked your advice on how to unify a divided nation, what would you say to him, sir?
Well, it's not for me, of course, to do such things. The earth belongs to the living and not the dead. But were I to do it, I would be very careful to tell him that the earth belongs to the living, that it's his responsibility and decidedly not mine. But I think I would say this: if you, after a period of great political divisiveness, extreme political partisanship and divisiveness, that it's in our interest to harmonize. And so I would urge the president to go to the Republican leadership and say, what things can we agree on? Let's sit down and find out what we can agree on, whether it's tax policy or, an infrastructure bill or our foreign policy or, whatever it might be. It's not for me to enumerate, but what are the things that we have a pretty strong mutual consensus towards? And let's do those things. Let's do all of those things first to build confidence and to make sure that we're not just operating by majority rule, which can be the tyranny of the majority. Let's go beyond that into some sort of genuine bipartisan decision-making consensus, if possible. And after doing that, and I'm guessing there are many things that could be done in that way. And after doing that, then I would say, all right, on these more controversial initiatives that my party wants to pursue, what can you live with? How can we compromise from our end so that the final legislation is something that your party can live with? What's the most you will concede, and what's the least we must concede to get some of your people, maybe all of them, but certainly some of them, to agree that this is a good piece of legislation? And then I would say, and we will do nothing. We pledge to do nothing that does not have X percentage of party crossover votes. That will be our policy. If you did that, your own partisans, of course, would scream and feel betrayed. But this is the only way, in my opinion, that you can bring back harmony in a nation that has been shattered into rival tribes and mutually disrespecting groups. It seems to me that's not so hard to do. And I think that if you did it with good faith, you would find that there's so much more that we agree on than that we don't agree on. And that probably is enough. The search for a full loaf is often one that ends in hunger, but the search for half a loaf, the ability to live with half a loaf, can really produce some important results.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson.
You are welcome, sir.
We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be speaking with the gentleman who portrays President Jefferson, the humanities scholar and author, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, now divested of wig, tights, and buckled shoes, and sitting across from me, virtually at least, is Mr. David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Happy New Year to you, David.
Happy New Year to you, sir, and welcome back from your many travels.
I've been out at that wonderful resort, Loxhaw Lodge, west of Missoula, leading humanities retreats, one on Whitman and Thoreau, and the other one on J. Robert Oppenheimer, the making of the atomic bomb and the decision to use the atomic bomb. More news about these online courses I'm teaching later, but to go back to the program, a very important program. Just before we started recording today, David, I got a call from a very close friend of mine who lives nearby, and she's a strong Catholic conservative, but she found that she could not accept Donald Trump for a range of reasons. I don't suppose she voted for Joe Biden, but I know she did not vote for Donald Trump. And because she was a Trump detractor, quiet, gentle, she had squabbles with her family that led to a cessation of conversations. Some are really at each other's throats, at least metaphorically. And she said that she's heartbroken that the Biden administration has undertaken things which have already so upset the Republican conservatives that she's despairing, that this is we're just going down the path of a yo-yo. First it's progressive overreach, and then it's a conservative overreaction, and it just looks like we're in an endless cycle here. So to what Jefferson said today, that if you really want to heal, you have to be exceedingly careful to accommodate the concerns, including irrational concerns, of the other party. And if you don't, you can't expect them to come around in goodwill. I see the point. I have no strong feelings one way or the other about this, but I do see that Jefferson, as a lover of harmony and a believer in national unification, worked especially hard in this manner, and he disarmed his critics. By the second term, even the Federalists thought, we don't necessarily like Jefferson or his policies, but we can certainly live with them.
I thought it very interesting. Some of the things that Jefferson said today really stuck out. One was the line about government should be a few plain duties done by a few honest men. Where did that come from?
That was one of his letters where he sort of defined what it is to be a leader, what the national government should do. And I love it. I think the exact quote is, "A few plain duties performed by a few honest men." And, we haven't always had honest men, and I don't just mean in the most recent administration, and the duties are by no means plain any longer. But you see, that Jefferson was lucky to live in a 3-mile-per-hour world, a much simpler world than ours. But I think that sense of not taking yourself too seriously, and you don't have to build utopia in the first 100 days or the first term or even in your lifetime. You just need to be moving towards a more just and equitable society, a society with greater opportunity, a society with limited government. And, it strikes me that many people today who are Jeffersonians, quote unquote, really believe in big government. But Jefferson didn't. Now, he might have come around if he'd lived through the 20th century, but if you look at him in his own lifetime, he never would have thought that a big, intrusive government like ours could ever be called Jeffersonian in any meaningful sense of that term, that the very basis of good government is that it's self-limiting, that it's minimalist. And that doesn't sit well with our time, but I think, is Jefferson still relevant? Yes. Not that we would have a minimalist libertarian government, that's over. But that we can always keep in mind that limiting government intrusion is a worthy idea to keep rattling around as we go through the difficult business of formulating public policy.
A couple of other things that he said that, of course, always stick out to me is his statement of elections matter.
I believe that so strongly. I wrote this book, Donald Trump and the Death of American Integrity, An Autopsy and a Path Forward. People can get it, if they like, on Amazon Kindle. And I started out by saying I'm not going to criticize Donald Trump for his policies because he won the election and he told us exactly what he was going to do. There was no doubt about what he was going to do. He said he was going to get out of the Iran deal, and he did. He said he was going to take us out of the Paris Climate Accords, and he did. He said he was going to get tough with NATO. He did. Said he was going to renegotiate our trade relations with China. He worked at that. He said that he was going to rewrite NAFTA. He did. He said he was going to try to build a wall on the Mexican border. He tried. So he told us that in the campaign that this is what he was going to do. In fact, he gets high marks for fulfilling his campaign promises. And he won. He won the election of 2016, not with the popular vote, but with the way we do adjust our elections, the Electoral College. And then he went on to try to do the things that he said he was going to do, including a Muslim ban. So I didn't want to criticize him for this because I believe so strongly that elections matter. My criticism of President Trump was about deportment and character and other things. And I think this is the sacred principle of our system. Joe Biden won. He won by 7 million votes. He won decisively in the Electoral College. He has a right to try to legislate the program that he outlined. And what is that program? You and I don't have to agree with it, but he wants to move towards a single-payer health care system, but at the very least, to shore up the Affordable Care Act. He wants to get us back into our international agreements with Iran and with the Paris Climate Accords, etc. And he's doing that. And then there are a whole series of executive orders about the public lands, about the LGBTQ community, etc. He's doing what he said he would do. The election was decisive. It's important that he have a chance to fulfill that. We shouldn't be angry that he's fulfilling the platform that he produced. If we don't like it, we should have not elected him, and we nearly didn't. He needs to be very careful. And of course, he's being pressured, as Jefferson was pressured from the left. Jefferson was profoundly pressured from the radical Republicans who wanted to throw all the Federalists out, who did want to undo Hamilton's fiscal system, who wanted to cancel the National Bank and repudiate the national debt, and to veer away from Britain and towards France and so on. And Jefferson said, I'm not doing that. I think I can hold the line against my own left.
So you're saying that Jefferson became more of a centrist after he was elected.
And why? Not because he was a timid man, but because he realized that the country doesn't agree that the Federalists were a significant force, and they liked the Hamiltonian system. They had created the Hamiltonian system, and to come in and destroy it simply because my party doesn't like it, Jefferson thought that was wrong-headed for several reasons. First of all, it would create instability. And secondly, that those people who were the Hamiltonians, the Hamiltonian Federalists, had not disappeared. They hadn't shrugged their shoulders the day after the election and said, fair enough, I'll just get on board with the new approach. they still ardently believed in their vision of government, and they were entitled to respect because of their vision of government. So that level of respectfulness and gentleness and harmonization and search for unity and centrism, that's an attempt to create a system that people can rally around, or at least grudgingly acknowledge is a just set of policies. And I don't think we're going to have it, in spite of what Joe Biden has said. And it breaks my heart, because I think that we're now in for another round of chaos. My concern is the 2022 congressional elections. I think that it's quite possible, if the Biden administration pushes too far, too fast, that they will lose both the House and the Senate in 2022, and then all bets are off. Then we're just in paralysis.
Well, I'm going to remain much more of a Jeffersonian optimist than you, sir. I'm going to give this new administration a chance. I'm quite impressed by a number of things that have happened, including something we talked to Jefferson about in an earlier segment. That is, recognizing the importance of science, the return to more of a normal sense of decorum, the daily press briefings. I'm going to give it a chance and not go quite as dark as you. But you also talked about, and Jefferson talked about, majority rules. And we're in kind of a dicey spot here with a 50-50 Senate. I wanted to talk to Jefferson more about the rules of the Senate and his opinions of reconciliation. What sort of parallels can we draw between the current administration and Jefferson's administration? What can we learn?
Well, I think we can learn a bunch of things. I want to say before I get to that, so that I don't forget, that one of the things that Jefferson had to do that nobody today has to do was to develop his own White House staff. We learned that when the Trump people left, that the General Services Administration rushed in and recarpeted and repainted and sanitized the place, and there's a full staff of chefs and wine stewards and other people that manage the house. Jefferson had to bring that, had to create that. He had to hire his own chef, a Frenchman. He hired his own maitre d', a Frenchman, and the White House was a construction site in Jefferson's time. So I just close my eyes and get a picture of that, of how fundamentally different that is from today, when within 48 hours, the GSA was able to go in and essentially completely swab down and redo much of the White House system. Here's where the Jefferson administration went wrong, David. He was so bitter about the judiciary, and especially the midnight appointments, that his Congress went after the judiciary with the Judiciary Act of 1802, and they reduced the number of judgeships, etc. This is an enormously partisan problem. And then they impeached first Judge Pickering of New Hampshire for drunkenness and incompetence, and then they impeached Samuel Chase of Maryland, a Supreme Court justice. And this attack on the judiciary was extreme. It went too far. It was seen as, in a certain sense, an erosion of the constitutional principles of separation of powers, and it backfired. They did convict Pickering because he was insane, but Samuel Chase was acquitted in a trial that was presided over by Vice President Aaron Burr, and Jefferson realized, he later said, that this was a mere scarecrow, it was a bungling way of going about things, but that he had taken his victory too far, and there was a spirit of vindictiveness rather than good government in that, and that it had produced a backlash. And I think that's a really important corrective, that you don't want to push measures that are going to so upset the other party with a spirit of mere partisanship and vindictiveness that it leads to bitterness. And that was the single greatest mistake that Jefferson made as president. And luckily, and I'm a Jeffersonian, but I think it's lucky that the Senate of the United States refused to go along, because almost every historian believes that if they had convicted Samuel Chase, who was a terrible guy, but he had not committed any crimes or misdemeanors or taken bribes, if they had convicted Samuel Chase in 1805, they would have gone after John Marshall next. That they were going to pick off members of the Federalist high judicial branch. And fortunately, it miscarried. And because of that, our judicial branch is much more independent now than it would have been had that occurred, or had FDR been able to pack the court as he tried to do. And I dearly hope that the Democrats don't try to increase the number of Supreme Court seats, because whenever that happens, it erodes the Montesquieuian principle of separation of powers.
And yet, that influence of the Federalists in the judiciary lasted for decades.
It did. He was right that Adams shouldn't have packed those courts. The date was December 12th when Adams knew that he had lost the election, and he should have at that point said, I'm just going to keep these portfolios on the president's desk. He can decide for himself how he wants to fill those offices. I think Jefferson was largely right about that, although Abigail Adams said, look, he's still president up until March 4th, so you get over it, Jefferson. I think that Jefferson was so upset by the appointment of John Marshall as Supreme Court Chief Justice that he overreacted. Marshall turned out to be a masterful Chief Justice, but he was a high Federalist. He moved the country towards a greater centralized, consolidated government, where the government was really on the side of the economy and the merchant class, much more than the people in the agrarian classes. And so this was a quiet revolution that was brought about largely by John Marshall and John Adams working in collusion in the last hours of the Adams administration. So Jefferson was rightly offended, but I think that his response was reactive, and I think he would say, if he were here, that anytime you're reacting rather than reasoning about your policies, you're likely to miscarry, and he did in this respect. But I have to say, he produced the most harmonious cabinet in American history. He presided over an extraordinary period of stability and growth in America. He was reelected in a landslide in 1804. He left office, even with the embargo crisis that had damaged him politically. He still left with the country really admiring him and regarding him as a sage, as almost as a philosopher prince who had briefly been president of the United States. He bought Louisiana, and then he sent Lewis and Clark and others out to explore it. He restored science to primacy. He moderated our foreign policy, both with respect to France and with respect to the United States. He balanced the budget. He retired more of the national debt than any president in American history by percentage. This was a really extraordinary presidency by a master of public administration. He said in a letter that he was working 10, 12, 11, sometimes 13 hours a day at his desk because he so wanted to master public administration. Adams had been kind of a weird, sometimes even indifferent administrator. And so Jefferson, who loved order, of course, more than almost anything else in the world, wanted to establish government as a smooth machine that was incredibly efficient. He corresponded with average people. He met average people at the door. He toned down the whole sort of high Federalist, ceremonial, semi-monarchical tone of government. This was a really consequential presidency. But the news you said, what's the news to Joe Biden? If I were Joe Biden's advisor, I would say, consensus, centrism, consensus, centrism, consensus, centrism.
With that, sir, we're going to have to bring this week's conversation to a close, but I thank you for an enlightening conversation.
Just to remind everyone, there will be lots of public online courses this spring, beginning with the Constitution course now underway, but then Hamlet for 4 sessions. We're going to do the J. Robert Oppenheimer retreat, but as an online course for 4 sessions, and we're going to do North Dakota and Great Plains literature for 4 sessions, all that coming before the 4th of July. So people could go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. They'll see all the details and they can begin signing up. I'm particularly delighted by the one on Hamlet. I've always wanted to teach adults out of school a public course on Hamlet, and this will be that 4 sessions on the greatest piece of Shakespearean drama and maybe the greatest piece of literature in the English-speaking world. So go to the website for all of that. We're delighted. It's going to be a great new year, David. I so appreciate you. Jefferson's already planting his lettuce. For you and for me, it's probably another 8 weeks.
Very good, sir.
Take care. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.